We, the Center for Global Development, we're a group that try and see how we can make the international system that supports global development work more effectively.
How do we finance infrastructure in the poorest parts of the world? How do we increase productivity in agriculture? What kind of policy brings out the best outcomes?
What CGD is about is you can ask those difficult questions that people refuse to ask and actually find solutions.
We're thinking about how climate change will impact migration patterns, how that will in turn have impacts on people's health.
It's challenging to be able to align budget with ambitious programmatic goals, but it can be done.
If you can help to make things a little bit better, that's a good way to spend your time. Good morning, and welcome to the Center for Global Development. Welcome to this panel discussion we're going to have on JETPs. That's the Just Energy Transition Partnership, for those of you who haven't got this rolling off your tongues yet, and the role of the multilateral development banks. And as for us at CGD this week, for those of you who've been following what we've been doing, we have a number of sessions that are focusing on the role of multilateral development banks, particularly as they try to take on board a stronger presence and contribution to dealing with global challenges, while also continuing to support countries with their poverty reduction agenda and with their development agenda. And JETPs are a novel construct to try and accelerate the energy transition in countries by bringing together all the international partners working with the country. The first one was announced, you remember, 2 years ago for South Africa. Then last year, there were follow-ups, 2 other ones announced for Indonesia, for Vietnam. And in and of themselves, how they succeed in accelerating that energy transition to a low carbon energy mix for countries in a way that is not just accelerating the transition, but is just, hence the JETP, and inclusive, is important. But marrying that up with this agenda for getting the MDBs to focus much more on this, and how you can get synergy from that in a way that will scale it up and be able to do this more is really a central issue. And so we have this wonderful panel of people who are going to give us their perspectives on it. And I'm really grateful to Annika Seiler for having put together this panel. Annika, of course, is a policy fellow here at the Center for Global Development. So I'm going to get out of your way and turn it over to Annika.
Thank you so much, Masood, and good morning. I'm really pleased and honored to moderate this morning's panel of distinguished speakers and accomplished leaders who together represent the stakeholders who can really drive and shape the just energy transition. From my left, I have Alice Carr, the Executive Director for Public Policy at the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Then Deputy Minister Rahmat Kaimuddin from the Coordinating Ministry for Maritime Affairs and Investment of the Government of Indonesia. Alexia Latortue, Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Development at the US Treasury Department. Jennifer Sara, the Global Director for Climate Change at the World Bank Group. Woo-Chong, the Asian Development Bank's Managing Director General, and Dr. Juergen Zattler, the Director General for International Development Policy, UN Agenda 2030 and Climate at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. That's long. And for those of you who are joining us virtually, you are more than welcome to add your comments under the YouTube feed or tweet at us at CGDEV. So now, without further ado, and since we have the voice of Indonesia with us, so let me start with you, Rahmat. And the government of Indonesia embraced this bold and really ambitious just energy transition as a policy priority when currently you are having 60% of coal in your generation mix, and your coal-based assets are relatively young, and you also have overcapacity in your main grid. So you're having all these challenges. What is your ministry, and how is your ministry contributing to driving and ensuring that this process is affordable, just, and really cost-effective?
Yeah, thank you, Annika. So as you just described, Indonesian problem is very complex. And we have a lot of discussion with my colleagues, my left and right, on this one. So I think initially there are multiple dimensions that we have to think about, on the just part. Both, first of all, within the country, we need to make sure that Indonesia should not be worse off in terms of development because of this energy transition. Indonesia is a developing country, and the economy is, like it or not, because we are blessed with natural resources, still have very strong dependency on fossil today. And if you were to create a plan moving forward, the socio-economic impact should be minimized. If possible, even become positive. And of course, Indonesia is also still a developing country, whereby the affordability or the strength of the economy is probably less than compared to our IPG members. So there's a lot of international cooperation need to happen to ensure that we get the best possible outcome. In terms of cost efficiency and affordability, and the cost effectiveness, for example, what we're trying to do is that in the process, we have to ensure that first everyone cooperate on this one. We have a North Star that we want to reduce emission without sacrificing economic development. And we invited what we call the best possible minds in the world to work on this. With the help of the IPG members, with the help of GFANS, we invited IEA, for example, the World Bank, UNDP, ADB, to come and say, hey, bring your best experts here, and let's design this together. And of course, with all this help, it will create a very transparent process to ensure the good governance of this process when the money is dispersed. And of course, affordability is something that we need to remind people that, hey, the electricity or this transition will be quite costly, and we have to make sure that Indonesia will have the right amount of electrons with this good quality and similar price with that. So that is the kind of constraints that we'll work on, and this we need to keep reminding our team and our cooperation for this to happen.
Thank you. Yeah, so affordability is the key word here, and so with that, let me move to the representatives of the International Partner Group, Alexia and Juergen. So COP27 was all about moving from pledges to implementation, and the Just Energy Transition Partnerships are this novel, as Masood also underlined, this novel approach who can really deliver this implementation. So from your view, what are the strengths of this approach, and how does it deliver also on the affordability and the additional funding? And my question goes to both of you, but since the US is co-leading on the policy dialogue with Indonesia and Germany co-leading on Vietnam, maybe you can focus on your countries. And Alexia, would you like to go first?
Thank you so much, Annika, and good morning, everyone. It's really great to be on this panel with literally friends, because this novel approach of the JETP really is a model of radical collaboration around, as Pakrat said, a North Star of reducing emissions. But it's not just about an energy transition. It actually, if I dare say, is about a whole of economy transition, which requires a whole of government action. So this is really a collective action exercise. And I think it was really easy for the International Partners Group that, as Annika said, the US is co-leading with Japan. It was really easy for us to come together because Indonesia articulated such strong climate ambition. And I think it's important to underscore some of this. So Indonesia really set its climate ambition with the following 3 indicators that are important, I think, to remember. One is that they committed to peaking power sector emissions to no more of an absolute value of 290 megatons of CO2 by 2030. Secondly, to accelerate the deployment of renewables so that it would be up to 34% of power generation also by 2030. And then they brought forward by 10 years, a decade, the achievement of net zero emissions in the power sector. So that's the sort of indicators around that North Star of emissions, and then doing it in a just way. And so we all know that there are economic dislocations that happen when you're moving away from coal, because there are a lot of people that depend on this both directly and indirectly. And so the just part is about affordability, but it really is about broad investments in communities that are affected as well. And I would say, you know, the social economic results of the JETP cannot just be not worse, it needs to be better. I mean, that's the vision that we're working on together. And so that's what we're trying to do. I think in terms of, you know, some of what is difficult, this is a multi-year complex exercise, right? You know, the good news is we have over $20 billion now of commitment from the public sector, the IPG, but Alice is here and she'll talk about the fact that, you know, we have the private sector also engaged, and that's a difference from the first JETP in South Africa that was just public sector commitments. So we're evolving as well as a model, which is exciting. Political leadership, critical, and again, it's across many ministries. Policy reform is important. So lots of the partners are looking at, especially the private sector partners, the development finance institutions, or the USDFC in the US is looking at local content requirements as an issue to be sort of resolved. There are issues of land to be resolved. If you're trying to do solar, we need the land space for it. So those are some of the issues that are complex. Technical difficulties in terms of the structure of Indonesia with thousands of islands. So you have overcapacity, yes, but that's not equally distributed. You have some places where access to energy is actually still a challenge, right? So I think figuring that out. And then the last thing I'll say, which is I think both a challenge but an opportunity, is just the huge demand that we're seeing in Indonesia in terms of power for industrial development. And if we look at critical minerals, which is also very important for the energy transition, you're lucky, you have a lot of good things in Indonesia, including nickel. And so these industries are seeing a need for power in the quite short terms, 3 to 5 years. That's very important. And the question is, can we deliver that power to be clean power to fuel that industrial development?
Thank you so much. I hand over to Juergen.
Alexia said it all. But perhaps a few issues. I think Alexia has already said whole of government. I think that's important. And it even goes beyond, you know, this is a new approach. In the past, when we dealt with partner countries, you know, every donor came in with his or her nice ideas, and then the government had to deal with it. A kind of fragmentation, which is not really very productive. Now, we are looking at the whole country. We say, okay, what does it take to help the country to move toward decarbonization, development, and so on. So we have joint objectives. This has a lot to do with ownership also. And we are sitting together and systematically discussing how we can help and how we can move the country into this new world. And it has been said, you have said, Indonesia should not be left off or so. And that's the point. I mean, this is the new world where we have to transition, to a new economy. And we want to sit together with our partners and discuss how this can be done, because otherwise the countries will be left behind, there will be stranded assets, and there are also first mover advantages. And I think there we sit together and we try to join forces, but not only, you know, by gathering all partners, but also by gathering all instruments. So we look at investments, we look at capacity, and we look at policy reforms. And policy reforms are so important because at the end we need the private sector. We also need the public sector. The public sector has to be strong and direct the whole thing. But at the end, the private sector has to come in with investments, for example, in renewable energy. That's the private sector who has to do it. We have to make the markets, like we do also in our countries, in Germany. In Germany, for example, we want to create a market for e-cars. So we are looking at all that the same way. We are looking at what do we need in terms of regulations, policies. What do we need in terms of public infrastructure? Then the private sector comes in. That's the same way we do. So it's not, like before we go to poor countries and, we have a nice idea, we could help you here or there. We're sitting together as partners and try to move the situation into that direction. And a private sector is very, very important in all that. We are talking about big numbers. And therefore, I think we have to address that problem to create a market, and not, but giving a little bit of guarantees here and a little bit of sweetness there. We have to comprehensively create a market in order to bring these big numbers into the whole setup. I think that's important, and also it's also important for Vietnam, of course. And we have some understanding that the partner countries, like also Indonesia, Vietnam, they want to also to make sure that the local economy benefits from all that. So we have some understanding. We have to discuss that. We have to find solutions for that. I think that's an important point, and that's also a challenge I can see. Another challenge is, of course, concessional money, because for some issues we need concessional money. This is very much linked to the reform of the World Bank at the moment. We will perhaps talk later about that.
Thank you. And this gives me the perfect bridge, because now we have had the first part, basically, of our brief, which is about the JETPs. So now we move to the second part, which is the role of the MDBs and the private sector. And Jennifer, can I start with you, please? Already we have heard during these spring meetings that the MDBs have to step up and have to support the green transition. So can I first ask you, what is your approach, and how can this maybe look like in 2030? It's supporting the readiness to transform and developing the capacity of your partner countries. I will ask a question on the scaling up of funding to Wu Chong, so maybe you can focus on the readiness.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, and it's wonderful to be here with this panel, and also to assemble people from the different parts of government, the minister, the G7 representatives, the development banks, the private sector, because that's what it is. It really is. We all need to work together, and I think that's what the reform agenda is, the reform of the World Bank, of the multilateral organizations, but it's also how do we all work together and blend our finance, our knowledge, and in support of countries. And JETPs are just the perfect way to do that, because it's a concrete challenge. The government's in the lead. It's a platform of investment and policy reform. And it requires it's a whole of government approach, as you say, Alexia, but the analysis that's needed as well. And I think that's where the World Bank and other multilateral development banks come in, is really trying to support the governments to do the deep dive analysis. And so we have, for example, the CCDRs. Many of you have heard of them now, the Climate Change Development Reports. And they're very, they really do help government look at what the range of options are, how do they achieve their development objectives, also looking at it from a climate lens. And if you look at the CCDR, for example, in South Africa, we have a big, the JETP there, it really does point directly to what the priorities are to improve the whole energy sector. It's not just about the decommissioning of several coal fire plants, but what is the trajectory for South Africa to address all of its energy needs, energy access, but energy security. And so there you also tease out what the policy impediments might be. And so then you're looking at the whole financial sustainability in that case of Eskom, but then also the market structure and how you can actually bring in the public sector reforms to bring in the private sector investment. And so there you can, from there you can unpack specific investment opportunities. In the case of South Africa, then there were investment packages. So we have the commodity coal mine that the World Bank was able to come in, but again, it's not the World Bank alone. This is where we take our World Bank IBRD lending, but we also blend it with trust funds, with concessional money from the Canada Clean Energy Fund, from the CIF. So that's the important thing, is to be able to bring in grant financing, concessional financing, MDB financing, and then open the way for the private sector to be also come to invest. And so in this case, also, as the important part is as you close the coal fire plant is to tease out what's public sector and what's private sector funding. So decommissioning a coal fire plant, closing it down, taking care of the environmental remediation, that really is public sector. In the case of Komati, you have 15,000 people who need to be reskilled. They need to be trained and looking at the possibility of relocating in some places for where the job's going to be. So again, is that public sector money? How do you come in to support the retraining, reskilling? And then, of course, you look at opportunities for investment in renewable energy. And that's what you want to do is phase down the coal power plants, replace it with renewable energy, and that's where, what are the policy and regulatory reforms that would allow for the private sector to come in with their investment. And we have a similar one that we did in Vietnam, and I think that's the important thing what the World Bank can contribute is working with government, is really looking at hard numbers and the facts and how can Vietnam also achieve its energy security. How can it really shut down? It has 22 gigawatts of installed capacity of coal right now. It has an indicative pipeline of 15 more gigawatts. So these are new coal projects. And this is important because these are new coal plants. It's a lot easier to shut down the Komati in South Africa. It was 20 or 30 years old. It's towards the end of their life. These are new ones. So they're assets that need to be bought out and replaced. And so then, and I'll stop right after this, but I want to come back to this importance of the reform, the public sector reform. So there's regulatory barriers in Vietnam that impede also how much ODA borrowing they can do. So it's not just reform in the power sector itself and getting the tariff right, but it's also making sure that there is ways for ODA and private sector to invest. It's unpacking some of the state-owned enterprises as well. So there's a really big reform agenda that's actually quite complex on the financing side that goes outside of the energy sector. So let me stop there. I think the role of the World Bank is really not, it's to look from the big picture, support government, crowd in and work with all the other partners around the JETP specific example, do the detailed analytics within the context of a CCDR, and then dive down into investment programming. So thank you.
Juergen, the Asian Development Bank and COP26 launched this Just Energy Transition Mechanism regional platform for Southeast Asia, and then subsequently established the country platforms, including in Indonesia. And maybe you could share how these country platforms really delivered scaled up and deliver scaling up of private sector investments in the just energy transition.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, first of all. All these years I've been working for ADB in this development. First time coming to this organization, and what a better panel to come into. We talk about transition, and I see more as a transformation in a way, because we are transforming. I think everybody's transforming, and so is ADB. And in fact, last few years been, during the pandemic has been quite important in the way we transform. And year 2021, for example, the big year in the middle of the pandemic, where we increased our ambition for climate finance from 80 to 100 billion. We updated our energy policy to remove coal, the new coal, and then also launched the JETP and the ETM, the energy transition mechanism. And these are some of the things that all have to work at the same time. Multiple things that we all talked about have to happen at the same time. And in fact, when we increased our ambition during the pandemic, our financing in climate dipped a little bit because of the pandemic issues. And so people thought we were crazy. So we try to be bold and ambitious and imagine what the world will be 2030, leading up to that. And we had to make this change at that moment to make it happen. And this energy transition mechanism is really important because over the last 15 years, ADB has been working quite strongly in terms of deploying a lot of renewable energy efficiency. From 2005, we doubled our investment from 500 million to 1 billion, and then again doubled to 2 billion. We're doing a lot of good things together with the World Bank and working with the SIFs and everything. But there's this big elephant, the old coal-fired power plants, which are relatively young in Asia. So how do we deal with this? And as Jennifer says, we got to decommission, and we have to make sure that that's done in a coherent and collaborative manner. And we cannot delete these power plants and have new coal power plants coming up again, which is a really, really important element of this work. So I've never seen anything like this in terms of this collaboration we are having across all the different stakeholders. And we may make mistakes, but we do need to move ahead. And lesson learned. So our very first ETM project was in the private sector, is in the private sector, Tirabon, and it's quite stressful. It's a new thing we are doing, and we are learning the way we learned from the experience of the World Bank in South Africa. We hope that we will generate lots of success stories in Indonesia and our region, and hopefully we can replicate as well. So, in terms of the other parts of the JET initiative, no one must be left. No one must be left behind. So, how do we support the countries to transition to low carbon, but also help the communities to deal with the loss of jobs resulting from the transition? So ADB again transformed itself in terms of the new operating model to make sure that we bring all the expertise from across the bank, so that we can help not just decommission power plants, but also bring in experts to help deal with the job issue in different industries, establish new industries that can flourish in the green world. So I think we're in a good place. We'll see, by 2030, hopefully we will succeed at the end of the day. I'm sure we will. And like I said, I don't think we've ever seen anything like this in terms of collaboration. And I hope that we can continue, and with a strong leadership from the key countries, and especially with the developing countries, Indonesia and others. I think we have to congratulate you for making this happen.
Thank you very much. And we already heard a lot about the need for crowding in the private capital. And Alice, now you are representing the global coalition of leading financial institutions who have all committed to align their investment portfolio to the Paris climate goal with assets under management of more than $130 trillion. And as Alexia also underlined, that as part of the JETP offers for Indonesia and for Vietnam, 50% is a pledge from members of the Asia network. And can I ask you, what is GFund's intent, expectation, and envisaged impact by being part of this JETP offer?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. So I'm just going to start by saying a few words about why we were so motivated to join this partnership. And that's because we have members that are more than 550 financial institutions globally who've each individually committed to supporting economic transition in line with 1.5 by 2050. And they made these commitments in the run-up to COP26. As mentioned, it's a very significant share of global finance, about 40% of global private financial sector assets. And now they're in the process of implementing those commitments. And I will say, just like any aspect of transition, it's really, really difficult. So they're now grappling with how, if you're a major global bank, do you transition your clients and everyone you lend to? And that is, of course, quite challenging. What we started to worry about, actually, was that unless we got involved with things like the JETPs and country platforms and so on, that the effect of focusing on transition could actually contribute to what we've seen in recent years, which is a kind of, I think, COVID-related disruption to cross-border financing. And so we wanted to make sure that in focusing on transition, we're thinking about how to get transition finance to everyone who's looking to transition with ambition, which of course is where Indonesia is. So we really wanted to get involved and start applying our brains to this challenge. The things that really work well for private finance about the approach that Indonesia is taking is the kind of ownership across government and the level of ambition is really important. That sends a really strong signal to private finance that if you're looking to invest in transition finance, this is where you should come and focus your efforts. But also the fact that, under this leadership, that the JETP has a very kind of structured program of work, which is to turn this ambition into a practical plan. And as we mentioned, there are many objectives that we need to deliver on, including affordability, development, and transition. But the fact that there were, this process of turning the ambition into reality is starting to take place is super helpful for finance and something that attracts finance to start thinking about how they can support the financing. But our main purpose, of course, in the partnership is to try and find new ways to finance these kinds of energy transition ambitions. And I would say that, this is a marathon, but we have been trying to sprint the first stretch. That might not be the best strategy, I don't know. I don't run marathons, so. But we have been trying to sprint in this early phase and kind of challenge ourselves and drawing on some of our members who really have very deep expertise locally in Indonesia, but also just in, the challenges of energy financing globally and structuring new products and so on, to think about how can private finance play its part across the spectrum of priorities that Indonesia is developing. So we are challenging ourselves. I mean, it was mentioned earlier about coal phase out. We are actually challenging ourselves to think about how could private finance come in to support coal phase out as well, which is not easy to do. And I take my hat off to the ADB for kind of leading into that topic, because it's not all public and private financial institutions, are keen to lean in. But we absolutely need to, because if we can't find ways to finance coal phase out, it just isn't going to happen. So we're challenging ourselves on that. We are challenging ourselves on how to bring more private finance into infrastructure that's needed for energy transition, into the renewables space, and also, as mentioned, into supporting development of economic opportunities around transition. And for us, it's really important that the advantages in transitioning don't just go to Europe and the US and advanced economies, but everybody finds their comparative advantage, and we make this a growth story. And so we're really applying our brains to that. And the ultimate goal, of course, is that by working together on so that we understand the plan, we understand the priorities, we understand the projects. We start thinking about innovative financing solutions to make our financing come in earlier, at greater scale. And I'll just finish by saying, this is a partnership and everyone's playing different and hopefully complementary roles. We really do want to see more leverage in the use of kind of public finance. And the way the JETP is set up is designed to start doing that more practically. So we're really looking to make sure that when we put public finance, wherever it comes from, into the projects, that we're always thinking about, okay, how do we get some leverage here and get some private finance in an affordable way, but just to make sure that we'll have a big enough quantum in the end to support all of the priorities that Indonesia is identifying. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And in the next round, I would like to bring this two parts together and see with you. And we have been talking a lot during the spring meetings about synergies and the partnerships. So Juergen, can you start? And then Alexia, and then Rahmat, and then I will turn again to Woo Chong and Jennifer and Alice, where do you see opportunities that that the JETPs and the MDBs and the private sector can maybe even further generate synergies to generate the leverage required to get to the scale and speed which the just energy transition needs? Thank you.
Yes, I think that's a key question. We need the MDBs to join in forcefully. That's clear. Of course, for example, when you look at policy and policy reforms, I mean, not every donor can go to the country and discuss with the country policy reforms. We need a kind of lead agency, and the World Bank is the World Bank, it's a global bank, so with convening power. So the World Bank has to play a very important role, but also in Asia, for example, the Asian Development Bank has to play a very important role. They started, but I think there is really room for improvement. And now we are talking about the World Bank evolution, the World Bank reform. So what do we want to see? We want, now I'm focusing on the World Bank, we want the World Bank to go to a country and then look at a sector, for example, the energy sector, and then do an analysis where the sector is, what does it take to go towards decarbonization and developing the sector. Systematically, the World Bank has already the CCDRs, that's good. It took a long time to put them in place, but finally it happened. The IMF started with it anyway. The World Bank had the private sector diagnostics. Years ago we started. Now they got, in a way, lost somewhere. Now it's talking about we need private sector diagnostics again. So these are the analytical instruments. And then identifying the binding constraints in that sector, in that country. What does it take? And there, of course, we need a very close relationship between the IFC and the World Bank. Because it's now the IFC is a little bit transaction-oriented, you know, looking for investors. And the World Bank is doing, I don't know, health, energy, whatever, but more on a project level. It has to come together. The World Bank has to help identify the bottlenecks and come in with appropriate instruments. And there, I think there is room for improvement. We started 4 or 5 years ago to ask the World Bank to come up with policy instruments like development policy operations, like P4Rs, for key countries, and there to identify key policy areas and to finance at scale with budget finance. It moves slowly, but slowly, very slowly, and it's not appropriate given the challenges we have out there. We were asking for it for years, but it doesn't really progress a lot. And therefore, the evolution now, I think, is an opportunity. There, both sides have to come together in a systematic way. I mean, I would even say all options should be on the table, even a merger of IFC and World Bank. Our governor, yesterday in the development committee, asked the management for proposing options, also radical ones, to solve the problem.
Thank you. Alexia, over to you.
So I think at the heart of the JETP model is this concept of alignment, right? Trying to really align all financing flows, whether they're MDB, whether they're public, whether they're private, whether they're philanthropic, which we haven't spoken about, but the philanthropics have certainly been looking at this model as well and are quite engaged. And so as we look to alignment, the MDBs have a really important role to play. They have technical expertise that's needed. They have deep experience and track records of working on policy reforms with countries. They have financing, And I loved what Wuchu said about imagining the future. I think this is what we're trying to do here. So they also have a role in terms of innovative financing structures and mechanisms that have not yet even been yet invented, and certainly ADB has been, quite creative on that front to get the kind of leverage also that Alice described. And they have, strong in-country presence and trusted relationships, which is critical to then bring me to the point of implementation. Announcements are great. It was a great moment in Bali at the G20 leaders, but the hard work is implementation. Yeah. And what Alice said about, the attraction to a structured way to translate ambition into delivery is really important. And so, for example, in Indonesia, we've agreed that the Asian Development Bank will be the secretariat for the JETP. We've agreed to create different working groups. One of them is the finance working group because it's important, and ADB is leading on that. But policy is critical. Juergen said it. The World Bank is leading on the policy group. UNDP is leading on the just working group. So there's a very strong role there in terms of really working through all the issues in a very systematic way to get delivery, to help define the comprehensive investment and policy plan that will really be the guts of JETP, and everybody will align around this plan. And so that's really critical. In this process, there are thorny issues that we're trying to work out. So for example, we talked about the importance of decommissioning coal. So do we have definitions in our taxonomies to understand what transition finance is? So if I'm buying a coal mine with the goal of shortening its lifespan, can someone understand that's different than me just having a coal mine? And can I actually get credit for having that coal mine on my balance sheets because I'm trying to shorten its life? And I think those are issues where, again, together we need to make very concrete progress on. Another example of alignment is part of the financing is working through this climate investment funds at the World Bank. And so as we were having very fun negotiations with Indonesia, we discovered there was quite a bit of captive coal. So that's off-grid coal for industrial uses. And so we were having one discussion in one place and then realizing in the context of the negotiations around accelerating coal transition, that the captive coal was not in that document. And so we said, oh wait, things have to be aligned. Let's slow down. Let's relook at the investment plan for the accelerating coal transition and make sure that also includes the captive coal. So that's, again, the power of alignment, is saying we're going to be consistent and coherent to achieve the goals that Indonesia set out for itself, as opposed to actually sometimes not being coherent with ourselves just because the left arm is not talking to the right arm.
Thank you. Thank you. This is very excellent, Rahmat.
Yeah. So if you think about it, at least from our side, the JETP or the transition is all mostly about technological shift and financing. That is the very big key. And of course, it will be supported by policies, the just and everything. And I have to say that the past year, has been a lesson of humility. I think we learn a lot about ourselves, we learn a lot about our partners, and I'm very, I want to echo what Juergen said, what Alexia said, that this has to be collaborative and all bets are off. We have to think about this as a pure problems. And typically people come with their own biases, and it's very difficult if you speak with very powerful people together and they have things that work in their own organization, and they said, okay, this is what you should do, and so it cannot be done like that. That kind of conversation has to happen, and I think that's why, I would say, Alexia become my close friends now. From very long discussion, a lot of them, some of them are tough, some of the elders. So that kind of mindset of being humble and willing to say okay, what I bring today may not be suitable, but maybe we can change it. So I think sometimes I describe an analogy of, if you're a very top doctor and a patient comes and they say, hey, Mr. Doctor, I'm sick. And the doctor says, Pak Rahmat, you have to do this, you have to eat that, you have to run this many kilometers, blah, blah, blah. And one said, like, oh, how do you know? You haven't even tested me, you haven't even asked me my problems, but you give me this. So, but if we, as a patient, you also have to tell them what is your problems. You know, you have to tell them, this is my situation, this is my lifestyle, and this is my constraints, this is my affordability, and all those things can only make the process better. And they say, hey, I need you to do this process to me, or some things. And of course, the last one that we want to highlight is that typically, if you work together as a government institution or MDBs, it's a lot about it's about having perfect plans, and then okay, if you're perfect, then I'll give you what I typically call, your placebo effect, right? So you cannot do placebo effect here. You have to start giving the treatment right away, little by little. So it's a lot of it is about iterative process, and because we don't know, this is new thing for any of us. So whether we can reach that goal, we want to. We'll put all our best possible effort, but it's a journey that we have to go together, and everyone probably need to change, because business as usual is not going to cut it.
Very strong words. Wuchang, how do you react to it? And maybe if you can try to shorten your response.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad I'm speaking in these orders, because I'm looking forward to hearing Jennifer how she's going to merge the IFC and the World Bank together. This actually, we have to meet 1.5 degree. It's a huge challenge. There's so much we have to do. But I think we do have the money and the technology. It's all there somehow. But what's missing is stronger behavioral change by everybody. At every level, at the institutional level. And, for example, long time ago, we were seen as the World Bank as competing with each other. No longer. We're together with all the partners here. Our competition is against time.
Yes.
We need to fight against time. And we need to get there as quickly as possible. And within each organization, we need to switch from lending to leverage.
Yeah.
Same L, but different meaning. And also, in terms of our performance indicators, when we did our very first private sector ETM deal, there were a lot of nervousness, because you might not make as much money in doing this, because it's just nature of the shortening the plant is different. So we need to change that, from the normal KPIs to something different, because it will not achieve the same effect. So all these things are happening, and within ADB, again, we have, as part of our organizational transformation, we have this program, a culture transformation initiative, where we focus on being more client-oriented, working with the clients, being out there, meeting the needs of the clients, having more trust within ourselves, up and down, but also with each other, which is harder to do than actually think about it. And finally, thinking differently, innovation and transformation. So we need to be out there in 2030, transform.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and it's good to go after you on. And exactly, because we're going to say the same thing. I mean, the first thing is, how do we move from competition to collaboration? And I think that's fundamental. And then also, how do we innovate and leverage more? But Juergen, I also appreciate, what you're saying. That's exactly what the World Bank's doing now. Can we do it faster? That would be wonderful as well. To go into countries and to support the government, to do the sector deep dives. That's fundamental, so that you don't just come in with one investment program, a JETP, closing down some coal mines, understanding the whole sectoral context, and we do that, So I think that's very, very important, but also even more important is that the government, how do we support government to be in the lead and government to coordinate everyone? And then also to do it around NDCs and long-term strategies. And I think that's a role that the MDBs can play as well, as building that capacity, a lot of support, CSF, we have, and the analytics, and to bring in knowledge from different countries and ideas to really help jumpstart and speed and look at innovative solutions. IFC, MIGA, World Bank, we're trying, it's interesting to hear, it's music to my ears. Let's work more together. We do that, we're trying very, very hard, and it's a lot easier to do around specific transactions. And that's with the GFANs too. I think what's important is we need to get the specific transactions. What are we going to collaborate on in countries on specific investments? We have a wonderful example of collaboration across MDBs with this Paris alignment, as we all get Paris aligned. It's a huge heavy lift getting into the details, but we're working on this hand in hand. But that does help us, and as of July 1st, that every investment we're looking at supporting a country, what's its development objective, and is it supporting the country achieve its low emissions trajectory, and also doing it in a way that's resilient and adaptive. And the fact that MDBs have similar approaches to how to analyze this is really, really important, because that's how you actually are really going to mainstream climate finance. And let me just find this also building on country initiatives. In addition to JETPs, you have the V20 who are now doing these climate prosperity platforms. There's all kinds of different platforms coming up now, people on food security. So I think the JETPs have served as a model around which you can collaborate. Now, this afternoon, we're signing with the GCF, providing grant financing for sustainable renewable risk mitigation. These are risk mitigation instruments that involve both the IFC and MIGA. So these are tangible programs in 9 countries that are putting the risk mitigation instrument there so the private sector can come in and invest in renewables and off-grid solutions. So these are specific examples. I think also building the domestic market capacity, the financial sector reform, the whole of the economy approaches is also important ways to crowd in additional financing, to look also at how you bring in the carbon markets. So we have to look at new ways of financing. And finally, I'll stop after this, is that the World Bank is not just the country financing, project operational financing, but it's what we can do to leverage the capital that we do have. As the bank, we've only had paid-in capital for IBRD for 20 billion. That's leveraged 800 billion over the last 40 years. So looking at that, leveraging the work of our Treasury in emitting new bonds, rhino bonds, clean bonds, green bonds, all kinds of bonds that do crowd in additional finance, and I think that's important as well.
Thank you. Alice, would you?
Great, thanks. So whilst listening to everyone else, I sort of identified 4 Ps that for me are about how we've got to work differently. I think the first one's been mentioned by quite a few others, which is the partnership piece. And I think that's what's different here in a country-led effort. And as mentioned, you avoid the fragmentation, and we have to also avoid competing with each other and trying to do more than is our part. We all just have to identify how we slot in and support the government of Indonesia in delivering on its objectives. So the partnership for me is really about the government setting their priorities, and then as all slotting in and playing our part and in a collaborative way. As mentioned, we also need to be humble and keep the lines of communication going, because this is really difficult work. The next thing for me is just the practical. So I think, we've all got high ambitions for climate transition. And I think what's good about this year, but also challenging about this year, is now we're trying to put those into practice. And it turns out the practice is quite difficult. So we need to really, really be focused on what we're trying to get done, think creatively about how are we going to practically make this progress, come up with new ideas. If they don't work, toss them aside, get something else. So it's really going to be a very practical focus. And I think all of the MDBs and other partners have particular areas of expertise that they can bring to the table. And we need to just, sort of draw on people appropriately. On the policy side, I just want to flag that we're lacking policy internationally. So, this isn't just about a country that's transitioning, changing its policy. If we work out how to do coal decommissioning in Indonesia, let's just take that to the G20 level and get it embedded so everyone can use it. Similarly, transition finance frameworks. We all know we need to transition. Time is running out. Let's just get clearer globally about what transition finance is. And then I just wanted to mention progress, because I think the strength of the JETP is the process around this, and we know it's a marathon, etc. But we also need to show tangible progress this year. So I just wanted to say that, while we totally welcome the structure and all the work streams and so on, each work stream will need to show some practical progress, because we have to show that even though transition is difficult and complex, that we can, by teaming up, we can get it done. So thanks.
Thank you. Since we are running short in time, maybe let's turn to the audience for a few minutes of questions. If there's, we already have some questions over there. Yeah. I think the microphone is there now. Who would like to answer?
Hi. Are we doing questions first, or?
We'll take them together.
One more question, yes.
Okay. Hi, Charlotte Fryer from Oxfam America. We talked a little bit about having a strong public sector to lead this transition and talked a little bit about affected communities. I'm interested to hear more on what safeguards and guardrails you feel are needed in this space when we're crowding in private finance. And then also talking a little bit more about how we ensure profit and prosperity won't be concentrated in private sector and with multinational corporations, with countries left with more debt.
Last question.
Okay, one more, and I think.
Thank you very much. Frederick Dahan, ODI. If a JETP, the platform, country-led is the model, that seems to be, any thought on how one may have to prioritize countries? Because if the demand starts building up, there may be a need to prioritize and decide who gets attention first. So what would be the criteria to make it just?
Okay. Alexia, would you?
Sure, happy to start. So the just piece is really critical. And I think we've evolved in our own learning from thinking about, direct, jobs for people who are working in the coal industry to find out what the new jobs would be, retraining, reskilling, which is important. I think taking actually a much broader approach is we really need to look at opportunities, livelihood opportunities, growth opportunities in whole regions. So we're taking a much broader approach. It's not a one-for-one job switcheroo, but it's actually what are the opportunities in the different regions that we're working in. So for example, when we went to South Africa with Secretary Yellen earlier this year, we went to visit coal country in Mpumalanga, and we had really big discussions about what are the opportunities in this region. And we talked about agriculture and what would it take to have better agriculture in the region, as well as talking about retraining and reskillings. And by the way, focused very much also on women and women being able to benefit from the new green jobs, because there's a potential upside here too in terms of the new technologies and jobs around solar and training people up in those areas. So I think the short message is we need to look at it holistically, broad community investment, thinking not just about direct coal workers, but all the indirect people who are affected. And the last thing I want to say is just around the country selection. I think the JETP, as for countries that are high emitters, is one specific thing. But as Jennifer said, I think this sparked a new hope and belief in sort of the country platform conversation about what that could look like. So I think there are different models for different types of countries. So what Egypt did, for example, and announced at COP last year around NAFWE is another model that actually is probably more appropriate for a greater number of people, where the story is adaptation and economic growth, not just, not this more focused on coal.
No, this is a great question. I mean, the just transition is very important. What's the just side of the transition? So the just side is, as I mentioned earlier, in Komati, there's actually a specific component about the 15,000 community retraining, who they are. And as you mentioned, like I said, these are communities that are not going to necessarily be in the same area. They might need to relocate. We're already starting to work with the government of India, also in Indonesia, to identify what the workers, it's not just the workers, it's the communities who are living near these coal mines, but also the opportunities for them not just to go, they can go into farming and agriculture, but also in the same supply chains of renewable energy. So how do we actually get new opportunities for developing jobs around the renewable energy in the same countries? We are decommissioning coal. So to use initiatives like we have the WeFi, which is to support female entrepreneurs, and now have an initiative specifically for climate and green, climate-related enterprises. So it's combining all these different instruments that we have in different initiatives and different programs around creating new jobs, reskilling, also putting social protection. And I also, on the just side, is the affordability of the energy tariff. And I think that's what's also important. If tariffs go out, who's going to make sure that they have to pay the additional cost?
I think Juergen first, and then Alice.
Okay, the question of selection of countries, I think, I mean, Germany, we do a lot of, cooperation with countries, with many countries in the climate area, and we also have other types of partnerships. But the JETPs is really with our partners together. It's not only bilateral, but with other international partners, and we focus on helping countries which are really very, very ambitious in their plans. So we have limited money and funding, therefore we try to focus on those countries with the highest ambition. And we have a lot of requests, but we can't go for every country because also simply we don't have the funding, and we need high ambition. The other point, I don't know if you understood well your question. I mean, how to get the private sector in the issue of debt. I mean, that's really a problem. We have high levels of debt, and the markets are not good, so private capital is shying risk. So in this difficult environment, to mobilize private investors to go to these countries is really difficult. And any new investment might create new debt. So we don't have a magic solution, but one element is that's also why we need concessionality. We need some concessionality. And the second point is that, we have to focus on policies. And policies can create fiscal space. Like, look at those 800 billion environmentally harmful subsidies around there in developing countries, in industrialized countries, it's the same. So we have to transform those harmful subsidies into something good, environmentally good and good for development. Like, for example, in adaptive social security systems. So that's a big task, I think. It's not easy to solve, but I think these are two elements we have to look at.
I was just going to quickly add on the point about public and private. I mean, if you look globally, emerging markets need $2.4 trillion of investment per year by 2030 to get to net zero. And whilst MDBs are doing a lot, I think public financing was around 70 billion. So there's a huge gap there. We can't get to net zero unless we pivot the private sector, and that's corporates as well as the financial sector, and point them in the direction of our public policy objectives. And I think that's what we're doing. And the other thing I just wanted to stress was that I think what we're talking about is invigorating local businesses as well as global businesses, both developers of the solutions, but also the financiers of the solutions. So it's not all about financing coming in cross-border. A lot of this is about creating the opportunities for Indonesian businesses and businesses located in Indonesia to get on the right side of transition, which is going to be a huge competitive advantage because getting on the right side of transition is where everyone needs to try and get to find their comparative advantage, because otherwise we do risk fragmentation, border adjustment tariffs and so on, and that isn't going to be a positive outcome. So I think I'd just say that there's a real need to have the private sector pointing in the right direction and trying to problem solve as well as alongside public partners.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we could continue for the whole day. There's lots of questions also from the audience, but unfortunately we have to stop here. I think we had very positive discussions around the partnerships and the structure and how everybody is trying to work through the problems. And it's not easy. And I liked what you said, that we have to make progress and have to try. And if one doesn't work, we have to go in an iterative process. So maybe next year we sit again here and talk about the progress. But thank you very much. And for everyone, just to let you know that in less than an hour we have here President Hoyer from the European Investment Bank with us for a conversation. So if you can hang on, and this will be a very interesting discussion, or join us virtually. So thank you very much to the panelists, and I'm really grateful about this wonderful discussion.